thank all of you who are present here. Thank you for making time for attending this panel presentation. So today, this is a special kind of panel because we have got students of Flame University and also a student from outside who are going to present their research work on urban land and its allied aspects. So the idea behind this panel was that even though there are so many practitioners and researchers in the field working in the arena of urban, we thought that we also must try to learn from the works of young people and what they are doing. So we are looking at students and from Flame and also other institutions who have been working on empirical as well as analytical research projects on the urban land and its allied aspects. So through this panel, what we are seeking to do, we are seeking to analyze land transformations that are taking place in Indian cities and how they are impacting ecology, social relationships, and environment. All these papers, so there are five different papers in this panel, and all these papers seek to use different methodological as well as theoretical frameworks. So the kind of papers that we are including here, so the first one is about one of the papers is about GIS that is being used to document changes in the vegetation cover in an urban forest in Bombay. There is another paper which is looking at a coastal regulation zone area and wastewater treatment plant in its surroundings and analyzing its implications for sustainable urban planning. Then we have another paper that is using GIS and secondary data to understand morphology of informal settlements in Delhi. We have one paper which is looking at development of Bangalore suburban railway system. And finally, we have a paper on studying the impact of RWA, that is Residence Welfare Association policies and housing market dynamics on single women and their access to rental housing in Indian cities, and also studying suburban housing in the frontier regions of Bengaluru. So the intent behind this panel, as I mentioned earlier, it is to highlight student researchers on pressing issues impacting land and its allied aspects in the urban areas. And the idea is to learn something new from the prisms of the young minds. So I would ask the panelists to come here. So Latika is with us. Latika, please come and have a seat. Latika is currently working as a research analyst in ESG data and solutions. She is a recent graduate from Flame University. Her major was economics and her minor was public policy. Latika, please have your seat. Then we have Raman Kirti. Raman, please have your seat. And he's also working as a research analyst, but in Mumbai. He's an economics honors graduate and he also graduated 5 months ago. Then we have Vandana Bhaskar. She's a sociology undergraduate and she holds a minor in public policy. Currently, she is Flame Scholars Program student in Flame. And we have Aura Shah. She's also FSP student currently, and she has done environmental studies major. So we have another student, but she's on her way. She missed the first bus. She's on the second bus. So she should be here very soon. Her name is Shreya SP. She's a final year civil engineering student at Government Engineering College, Barton Hill, Trivandrum. So without much ado, I'll ask our speakers to begin their presentations. So Raman, you'll be going first. And you have got total 12 minutes of your time. So 10 minutes, I'll give you a warning sign, and 12 minutes, I'll ask you to stop. So thank you, Raman. Over to you.
Morning, everyone present here. Before I begin with my presentation, I'll take this opportunity to extend my sincere gratitude to Professor Anup Tripathi and Professor Prasad Pathak for helping me through this paper. The topic of my presentation is understanding the morphology of informal settlements in Delhi from the lenses of sustainable urbanization using spatiotemporal data. It's a known fact that Delhi has the highest population density of about 11,320 person per square kilometer, which is actually outdated with respect to census 2011. And despite there has been a decadal decline in a decadal growth rate over the period of 1991 to 2011. about one third of Delhi's urban population still lives below the substandard level of living, which often lacks safety, adequate housing, and basic services like water. According to the projections of MPD in 2021, Delhi needs 24 lakh new housing units by the year of 2022. The city's complex urban form is the result of rapid migration to the city, which led to the unplanned growth, years of inequality, and rising housing demand. And this makes it important to understand the sustainability of livelihood of informal settlements in Delhi and how it has an impact on urban land surface temperature. So my research question is understanding the relationship between morphology of formal and informal settlements in Delhi and land surface temperature and its impact in sustainable urbanization using spatial temporal data. The research aims to objectively examine the spatial patterns like morphology or spatial patterns of morphology like surface temperature, population density, status of land, and type of housing of formal and informal settlements. The research will quantify the spatial variation in land, surface temperature in informal versus formal, as well as the research will investigate the morphology of rural as well as urban informal settlements in Delhi using census and NSSO data. Review of literature. The paper by DuPont and Gowda in 2019 talks about the challenges faced in implementing some rehabilitation program and resettlement program in Delhi. It highlights that the slum resettlement program focuses on resettling the slum dwellers to the peripheral area of the city, which without assigning proper housing facilities, which mainly lacks proper infra and has a very difficult commute problem for the informal settlements or the slum dwellers. The author specifically emphasized on housing rights while formulating slum resettlement policies, thereby ensuring sustainable development. Similar observations were made by Jonas in his 2017 paper. Another paper by Devon and King emphasizes on the morphology of informal settlements, wherein the paper highlights that the areas which experience hotter temperature are densely populated, frequently unplanned, which are actually commonly found in informal settlements, especially in the peripheral parts of the urban area. And similar observations were made by Wang et al. In 2018 paper. Then there is the paper by Frezen et al., Arif et al., and Ahmed emphasizes the significance as well as the need for planned government intervention for the betterment of slum householders and long-term residual development. This research uses prevalent works of literature as a basis of the research to discuss the theoretical and empirical contribution with concerning the morphology of formal and informal settlements and understand the implication on land surface temperature. Empirically, using geospatial data and descriptive stats from NSSO and census data, this research examines the morphology of formal and informal settlements in Delhi, draws the implications across both implications on land surface temperature across both formal and informal settlements. The research quantifies the spatial morphology across four different indicators. The first one is surface area of the informal settlement, population density, second one. Third one is the type of housing, whether it's a pakka housing or kacha housing. And fourth one is the status of land on which the informal settlements are residing. Through the use of correlation studies, these four indicators will be analyzed with respect to their contribution towards surface temperature. This is the expected hypothesis of the research. The first expected hypothesis is with respect to the spatial relationship between informal settlements and land surface temperature. And the second expected hypothesis focuses on the morphology aspect of the informal settlements. This is the study area. The reason why I chose Delhi is it is currently the second largest city in terms of population and will overtake Tokyo as the world's largest city in terms of population. And it's a known fact that it's the population density of Delhi is, in terms of population density, Delhi is number one in the world. And as a part of informal settlements, I'm looking at the informal settlements near uh, Tughlaqabad Fort. So from the above image, one can notice that over the period of time, the land surface temperature of Delhi has been constantly changing has been constantly changing. And one can also notice that the land surface temperature in the center of the city, as well as the eastern side of the city, where the river is located, uh, is comparatively lower than the peripheral of the city, especially the western part of it. This is primarily because uh, the the presence of barrel line in the western part of the city, as well as the rapid development in the center of the city. However, this study was this through this the study wasn't able to explain the relationship between surface area and average land surface temperature, as there was no significant difference across small and large settlements across Delhi. Going forward, the research examined the Google Earth images, which revealed which revealed a noticeable increase in density of the marked area. With these images are with respect to the settlements near Tughlaqabad forts, and over the period of 2012 to 2022, we can see there is a growing increase of concentration of informal structures and activities in that particular region. And the Mark settlements is not only densely populated but also is unplanned, which was actually noted by Devoy and King in their paper. Whereas the formal settlements, these are the DDA flats in New Delhi, have grown in a consistent pattern with a definite structure and meticulously planning, fostering sustainable urban growth and organized community living. From this table and the graph, it highlights the relationship between slum population and land surface temperature. The study found a moderate positive correlation between average land surface temperature and slum population with a coefficient of variation of 0.47. There are roughly about 1.8 million slum dwellers in Delhi, and although Delhi's percentage of urban population has increased over the period of time, providing formal housing to slum dwellers has always been a challenge. However, the issue is not that the government is unable to provide formal housing to the dwellers. Interestingly, according to the census report in 2011, Delhi's housing stock has been increased over time. The issue, while doing further research, I found that the issue is not the issue is with respect to housing supply. In essence, the housing supply gap with respect to Delhi remains large. From this NSSO data, one can notice that there has been decrease in houses. However, the decrease is not substantial enough to impact the housing supply. Then the research looked at the tenure status of the housing slum dwelling units in Delhi. The total housing ownership of dwelling units in Delhi's urban area has only increased moderately over the period of time, while the figures for the rural part have stagnated for the most of the time. This demonstrates that housing supply gap in terms of dwelling units provision has grown between 2012 and 2018. The problem with the land ownership in Delhi is about 30% of the slum are in the state government land, while the remaining part of the lands are on center government land, and various department agencies are confused about land ownership. Ownership of land or dwelling units is crucial as it increases the ownership of slum dwellers, which reflects city's ongoing sustainability process. Moreover, the average size of of households living in Delhi, slum dwelling units in Delhi, has increased from 4.1 to 4.5 between 2012 and 2018. while it has increased about while it has declined in the rural areas, it is still above the congestion level according to the UN report. Conclusion: the estimated household lives living in slum dwelling units in the rural part have declined, not significantly enough, mainly due to the migration into urban areas. This may be because in the urban areas there is better availability of employment opportunities and a better infrastructure, overall infrastructure facilities. Also, the quality of dwelling units is better in urban area, which may act as an incentive for this migration. The government's top goal in recent year has been to improve housing in Delhi, along with providing housing for underserved neighborhoods, including the rural parts of Delhi. But the focus is not as much as it's deserved, and therefore in this part, I'm just summing up. And therefore, in situ slum rehabilitation housing projects comes into the play. Under this scheme, the government is providing good pakka houses for those who are living in the slums. The government should not only focus on providing better housing in order to improve the housing situation, but it should also focus on policy regularizing the slums in Delhi, because the in situ rehabilitation housing scheme is only for the regularized slums in Delhi. And according to Delhi government, about 1,797 unauthorized colonies in Delhi are there, which must be regularized in order to be eligible for this in situ slum rehabilitation program. Also, there is a significant need for policies with respect to the ownership of the land where the slums are located, as this will not only improve the ownership of the land for the slum dwellers, but also it will improve the dwelling units structure, thereby improving the living conditions of the slum dwellers. Thank you.
Thank you, Raman. We now have next, so we'll take the Q&As at the end after all the presentations are done in the interest of time. So next we have Latika. Her paper is titled Development of the Bangalore Suburban Rail System, Upsides and Roadblocks.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Latika Adlakha, and I'd be presenting on the development of the suburban rail system. Just looking at a general reflection on what are the upsides and roadblocks of development of such a transport system. I was guided by Professor Prasad Pathak and Professor Anup Tripathi for this paper. Just giving a brief background of what exactly the topic is all about. So, we know that Bangalore is now at the forefront of the booming service industry in India, and there is rapid urbanization and expansion that has taken place in the past few decades. So, owing to this rapid development, we can see that there is also quick development of residential as well as commercial areas in Bangalore city, but the road infrastructure and the transport infrastructure is unable to keep up with the growth in the city, which is a very infamous problem in Bangalore. And this has made travel from one part of the city to another a real hassle. So, this extensive growth over the years, which is also not very planned, calls for a need to develop efficient integrated systems where we look at forming a comprehensive mobility system so that it's reliable, affordable, and bunch of the population can travel conveniently on a daily basis. So, suburban rail networks are said to be indispensable arteries in the modern urban landscapes. Why so? It's because they seamlessly connect city centers to the outskirts of the city, because there is a cost benefit as well as availability of space, as and when people tend to move out of the city. So, we can see that Bangalore has seen a boom in its growth in terms of people getting spread across the geography as well. So, a suburban rail network would have great promise for, say, solving these transit issues. So, Bangalore Suburban Rail Project, BSRP, took the first step towards reality in 2018 when the Railway Board announced that we would be developing a new suburban rail system under the suburban rail policy. So it got approved by the Union Cabinet in October 2020. Uh, and ever since, the execution of the project has been given a 6-year deadline. So, a special purpose vehicle has been set up to implement this project, which is a joint venture between state government of Karnataka and the Indian Railways. It's called Rail Infrastructure Development Company, KRIDE, is what the suburban rail system in Bangalore would be called. And after the pandemic, Prime Minister Narendra Modi had changed the deadline. He set a 40-month deadline for the project. So it's set to be completed around October 2025. So I didn't want to get into a particular literature review as such. So I'd just be giving you a little bit of context from the papers that I've read and what has been observed as a general pattern in literature. So globally, you can see that there are many places, many cities, Tokyo, Paris, London, which tend to have effective transport systems or a development of a suburban rail system. They have been able to reduce congestion and connect large parts of the city from the city center. So these systems are not only supportful to the daily commuters who travel to work or for education purposes or other, but also regional economic integration has been able to uh, grow over time. It's because there is a sustainable alternative given to commute for people. So it's a model that underscores potential benefits for Bangalore as well, as it faces growing congestion and infrastructure issues. So, Indian cities also like Mumbai and Chennai have established the role of suburban rail, and we know how efficient the system works in these two cities. So, there have been strengths and challenges in such systems, which I'll be getting into later. But you can see that there is economic mobility benefits, as I mentioned. But another issue remains, as in India, most places, overcapacitating such um, systems. So, Bangalore has to leverage the existing railway infrastructure and offer a more cost effective and quicker solution to transit. So, it also reduces the demand for new construction because we had to lay down metro lines and it takes a bit of time for the sanctions to get approved. But the suburban rail uses existing infrastructure. So also there is papers have observed collaborative governance, the need for collaborative governance models to be implemented, where government and private entities come together with public oversight and private sector expertise. So they can ensure efficient development of such systems, operations, and maintenance of the suburban rail network across India. So it does make it a robust and widely adopted commute choice in Bangalore. Just to give an overview of the project itself, there would be four main corridors in the Bangalore suburban rail system. It's a 149-kilometer long railway network that covers the entire railway network of the city. So, in some ways, it is going to run in conjunction with the metro lines that Bangalore is planning to develop over the years. Um, so there is the Sampige line, which is 41.4 kilometers. The Sampige line, as you can see in the picture, is one of the major areas where people tend to commute. And another one would be the Mallige line, which is 25.5 kilometers, Parijata line, 35.5 kilometers, and the Kanaka line, which is 46.8 kilometers. So the map shows that the rail is passing through the main areas of city, therefore touching areas of commercial importance as well as residential areas. So also there are main congestion areas around the IT area where you can see Whitefield being mentioned in the map. So those are areas where people tend to commute on a daily basis from the north side of Bangalore, uh, owing that the IT sector lies completely in that area. And Also, there is a 15,767 crore outlay for this project, where 2.47 crore is coming from the center and state, and 7.43 crore is multilateral funding. It has been taken up, and Larsen and Toubro has taken up the development of the Kanaka line. So, just a general reflection on what exactly we see as a pattern in Bangalore. Population growth has been massive, as is in many Indian cities, the big ones. So, it has grown dramatically owing to the IT boom, and due to that, there has been an inflow of experts who are looking to work with conjunction of the authorities to make it an innovation powerhouse. And there is expansive growth of population seen in the city due to this. So, as you can see in the graph, it is approaching about 14 million, yeah, 14 million in the coming years, or has already achieved. And this exponential increase has put in demand, has increased demand of existing transport infrastructure, and obviously there have been straining there has been a strain on the public transit system as well. So over 2 decades, roughly about 119% increase seen in Bangalore in terms of population. So there have been flows. First, people started flowing into the main parts of the city, and since that wasn't enough, Bangalore grew into the satellite towns which are surrounding neighboring towns. So uh, there has been great flow of citizens into the outskirts of the city as well. So you see people commuting on a daily basis, long distances, and spending hours in traffic. So that is one thing. Then another is the vehicle composition in Bangalore. So we see that there is 91% of the vehicles that move in Bangalore which are non-transport vehicles. And as you can see in the figures as well as in the pie chart, that there's a dominant role of non-transport vehicles in the city's transport system, with public transport like buses and taxis forming only about 3% of the total vehicle population, which requires some kind of attention, as we should push people to take more public transport so that we can make this comprehensive system. So the estimated ridership, this was given by the K-Ride authority as well, uh, itself. So they have created a four-stage travel demand model where they are looking to cater to about 10 lakh passengers on a daily basis. And as you can see, the Kengeri to Whitefield line, sorry, not the Kengeri to Whitefield line, the KSR Bengaluru to Devanhalli line is going to have the most amount of people traveling, because that's where the airport lies. And that is an important connection for the city, as we see people traveling in and out for business purposes in Bangalore. Also, there will be an immediate impact on the IT corridor of Bangalore, with 2 lakh daily riders moving towards the IT hub, as I mentioned, which is the Whitefield area. So, just few points of discussion uh, that sum up the development of this rail system is that there is a need for, as we look towards development of efficient transport systems, we are also looking towards moving to sustainability on a very, very fast basis. So the utilization of pre-existing infrastructure is a major plus point for the Bangalore suburban railway system, where we see that metro requires us to we still lack some technological capabilities for metro, because we are getting substantial funding from the Japan International Cooperation Agency for our Bangalore metro, and also sanctions take time. So as and when we move towards more sustainable alternatives like this, we should look towards uh, creating some kind of nexus between the bus infrastructure in Bangalore, the metro, and the suburban rail system. Also, because we know that India has been self sufficient in terms of technological capabilities of developing uh, railway systems. So just a last bit of discussion that I would like to do here is that we see an RER system that is set in place in Paris, which is the suburban rail system in Paris, and it relies completely on nuclear as well as hydroelectric energy, which achieves an impressive 99.8 degrees in the GHG emissions compared to cars. So so this would also mean that we are going to be uh, pushing away a little bit of the fuel heavy vehicles that we are looking to shift to EVs as well. So since the suburban rail would run completely on electricity, that is a major plus point. And also, it's fairly straightforward to set up this infrastructure. As I mentioned, it's because intercity train lines are easy to establish between the heartland and the suburbs of the city. Uh, Although it does have a few downsides as well. One thing would be that to achieve such public infrastructure aspirations in India requires a lot of a lot of divergence between interests and obligations between the state and central governments, and also we can see that uh, any kind of project that is taken up in India is prone to massive amounts of delay, which is the case with this as well. So that is one thing that needs to be tackled on a very minute basis, because we are looking to build the suburban railway before the metro, because metro takes a lot more time to set up. So the process of acquiring land and subsequent displacement of people presents a substantial obstacle in this project, and it would also cut through. It would also cut through a lot of residential areas. So there would be relocation of a few people and residents. And but one good thing would be last mile connectivity. So I'd like to end here, and I would just say that it's not just a mere transport initiative, but a strategic investment in the city's future, especially for Bangalore, because all of us have been discussing in and out that there has been a crazy traffic problem there. And so we would connect efficient transport systems together, buses, metros, suburban, and also unlock massive amounts of economic potential in terms of educational opportunities, or people moving across the city in a more easier manner. People are able to travel to work in a much more calm way. So that's all I would like to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Latika. Shreya, will you go next? Yeah. So now we have Shreya. She is a final year civil engineering student at Government Engineering College, Barton Hill, Trivandrum. The title of her paper is Wastewater Treatment for Sustainable Urban Planning, a study based on Vidinjam and adjacent coastal regulation zone areas.
So, good morning, one and all. Myself, Shreya, and I'm here to present the topic Wastewater Treatment for Sustainable Urban Planning, a study based on Virinyam and Urgenson CRZ areas. So, coming to the introduction part, Virinyam is it's an area, it's a coastal region in Trivandrum district of the state of Kerala in India. And it's a home to an recently established international seaport, and it is adjacent to the popular tourist destination of Kovalam. The area is recently experiencing rapid urbanization and development after the establishment of seaport. Okay, like trade and every kind of like transportation, it's actually booming up, and residents are actually primarily they're relying on dug wells for drinking water, and tube well is also the usage of tube well is also very limited. And the thing is that the groundwater of Virinyam, it's highly polluted. The reason behind is that the water table of Virinyam is really high, and most of the people who are dwellers of Virinyam, they are from fishermen community, and they actually um, they dispose their sewage waste in cesspits, as a result of which the sewage it seeps into groundwater, as a result of which groundwater gets polluted. The average nitrate concentration in open well water is about like 6.57 mg per liter, and in some of places like Panathura and all, it exceeds the limit of EPA standard. Like it exceeds 10 mg per liter. And coliform bacteria is also present in the groundwater, and it is likely, and various studies suggest that it is likely to due to poor septic tank practices and open defecation. So coming to the relevance of the project, mainly after the establishment of international seaport, the amount of people migrating to Virinam, it's increasing, but the land available, it's not. I mean, the residential area which is available, it's not increasing with the demand. So, and due to the increase in population, the amount of wastewater produced, it's also increasing. And but they doesn't have any kind of proper treatment facilities in Virinam. And coming to the environmental protection, as I told you earlier, the groundwater is really polluted, and in order to mitigate the groundwater pollution, as well as to contain the growing demands of people, a wastewater treatment plant in Virinam is really necessary. And okay, so coming to the methodology part, primarily data collection and site reconnaissance, and we actually went to the site, and we recorded the latitude and longitude of the study area while pacing at an interval of 20 meter. And secondly, we perform population forecasting. We perform population forecasting by making use of like IS standards, as well as uh, IS standards, and we forecasted the population up to like 2074. And secondly, we prepared a sewage network layout using AutoCAD by using the data of longitude and latitude of the study area. And fourthly, we have to the study is currently going on, so we perform all the three steps of the project, and fourth, five, and six steps are yet to be performed. So the fourth step is designing of components of wastewater treatment plant, and fifth step is site selection of sewage treatment plant, and that will be done by using the sewage network layout, and with the help of software ArcGIS. And sixthly, we have to perform 3D. We have to make a 3D model of the treatment plan, and we have to test the 3D model using GPSX software. So coming to the discussion, so the data collection on urban infrastructure and various environmental factors is completed. The sewage network layout, it has also been, and the spatial analysis has begun to identify the potential sites of wastewater treatment facilities, and the capacity of the proposed plan is to be it's calculated to be 50 MLD um, uh, after doing population forecasting, and after estimating the anticipated amount of wastewater which will be produced. And the capacity of the plan has been found out, okay, after considering the population of Virinam till 2074, and the site selection for the proposed plan and the design of the various components of the treatment plan is currently in progress. And some suggestions are there, like government should ensure that the environmental rules and policies are to be ensured. And this project might displace a few people of fishermen community, but see, like the project is actually really important when it comes to public health, and also like in order to mitigate the environmental impacts, the project is of it's of very high importance. So thank you.
Thank you, Shreya. Next, we have Aura. She's a flame student. Her paper is titled Spatial Analysis of Sanjay Gandhi National Park and Surrounding MMR Region, documenting the change in vegetation in and around Sanjay Gandhi National Park and the expansion of the city using remotely sensed satellite data.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Aura. I'm currently an FSP student, and since my major is in environmental studies, I'm going to be looking at Sanjay Gandhi National Park, which is a national park in Mumbai. In recent decades, we've seen a rapid shift from rural to urban landscapes, especially in developing countries, and in developing cities like Mumbai. Here, people are moving from villages and towns nearby to metropolitan cities. The global population has been growing for the last many decades, and this growth has brought major impacts to natural environments in these cities, with expanding urban areas often consuming forests, grasslands, and other natural spaces, which also includes farmlands. In this study, I have focused on the impact of urban expansion on land use and land cover in Mumbai, which is one of the most densely populated and rapidly growing countries in India. My research centers specifically around Sanjay Gandhi National Park in Borivali, along with the urban areas that surround it. I want to understand how population growth in Mumbai has affected land use and its vegetation in Sanjay Gandhi National Park to evaluate how successful this protected area is and how well this area is coping with the nearby urbanization. So this is the population growth in Mumbai, and covering approximately 17% of Mumbai and Thane's combined area, this national park serves as a green lung to the city. And it houses centuries old Buddhist caves like the Canary Caves, also sacred groves and crucial water sources like the Vihar and Tulsi lakes. It is more than just a tourist attraction because it plays a vital ecological role. It is home to diverse flora and fauna, including leopards and rare birds like the grey francolin. And mainly, it helps absorb the carbon emissions, which is especially critical in such a densely populated urban environment. But urban encroachment in the last many years has been a persistent challenge to Sanjay Gandhi National Park. And with Mumbai's population nearly doubling, the pressures keep growing on this natural habitat. Research has shown the impact of urban expansion around Sanjay Gandhi National Park's buffer zones. And for example, Bhairwani et al. In 2021 used remotely sensed data to study the land use changes and found a 140% increase in built up areas around Sanjay Gandhi National Park. This switch from green cover to urban built has affected the local microclimate of the region and has raised temperatures throughout the city. And although the core of the national park remains somewhat stable, nearby urban growth continues to impact the whole region, but especially the buffer zones and the boundaries. I have primarily used satellite imagery and geographic information systems here, and I used data from the year 1989 and the year 2022 to compare how the green cover and urban built has changed between these two time periods. I sourced the data for the year 1989 from the Landsat 5 satellite, which focuses on the thematic mapper. And for the data from 2022, I have used the Landsat 8 satellite with its operational land imager and thermal infrared sensors. To maintain consistency and minimize the seasonal changes as we see in Mumbai because of dry summers and heavy rainfall, I selected imagery that's only 4 days apart, so the comparison is less biased. I also used images with 0% cloud cover to ensure that the views are similar in terms of not having any obstructions. I also incorporated elevation data, as we see here. I've done this from the shuttle radar topography mission. And here we can identify that Sanjay Gandhi National Park is actually significantly elevated and has various amounts of elevation compared to the city of Mumbai that surrounds it. I converted all the files from Landsat 5 and 8 to reflectance files. and I made false color composites of different red, green, blue combinations or RGB combinations. I tested various combinations. This is just one of them. Here I have used bands 453 in 1989 and correspondingly for 2022. The various combinations help me understand what selection of bands and what groupings of bands are actually showing me what I want to see, which is mainly vegetation and urban build. So here, the urban areas are represented in light blue and light green. The vegetation is the one you see in orange, which is mainly the shape of Sanjay Gandhi National Park. The water, which is the river that runs in the top, and the two lakes, Vihar Lake and Tulsi Lake, they are both seen in dark blue. And a grouping like this shows us that there is a pretty big difference between the vegetation inside Sanjay Gandhi National Park and the urban build outside it. I also focused on the NDVI maps because this is the NDVI maps stand for Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, which is one of the most commonly used vegetation indexes. This would help me document and evaluate the change in vegetation cover. This is the formula I used. And I use supervised classification to understand, which bands are representing which elements. So, for example, blue is water, white is urban build. I've used black for sparse vegetation, pink for moderate vegetation, and green for high vegetation, with purple for very, very dense vegetation. One of the most stark differences between these two time periods is the increase in the white color, and the white stands for urban build. We also see that a lot of the black and pink regions have decreased, the black and pink being low to moderate vegetation. Now, firstly, the white, which shows urban expansion, tells us that one of the most notable changes is the dramatic increase in urban build, and the urban footprint around Sanjay Gandhi National Park has only increased since 1989. And now it is approximately expanded to almost 100 square kilometers, which is a 20% increase in built up land. This is also a reflection of the population growth and the kind of things that come along with population growth, which is an increase in infrastructure, an increase in roads, and especially housing. Now, if we compare the elements, we see that we have urban build, which has increased by double, and we have sparse vegetation, which has decreased by double. So this shows us that the urban build has actually replaced the sparse vegetation and has also replaced a little bit of the moderate vegetation. Now, the sparse and moderate vegetations have decreased, and this is a pretty significant decrease because it's almost 80 square kilometers. And this suggests that when the city is growing, it's not only growing horizontally, but it is expanding and encroaching into areas that initially supported wildlife and green cover. And when we talk about biodiverse areas, we're not only referring to forest cover or dense forest, we're also talking about farmlands or plains or just areas that have biodiversity but are not directly visible like we would see in a forest. Interestingly, actually, there has been an increase in the very dense vegetation, and the dense vegetation has actually stayed almost the same. Now, this does seem counterintuitive, given that the sparse and moderate vegetations have decreased significantly. But the reason this does hold true is because this increase in very dense vegetation it has resulted from the kind of projects that are going on inside the park. So this includes like habitat restoration projects, afforestation projects, and of course like the legal protection that India has offered its national parks. But this increase in very dense vegetation is not enough to offset the overall loss of green space and unurbanized land. Another notable change is the slight reduction in water bodies, because this is primarily for the lakes inside Sanjay Gandhi National Park. And these reductions can be attributed to a range of factors, which could be encroachment, but also sediment buildup or altered water flow patterns because of climate change and also because of the surrounding urban development. So, while the conservation efforts within the park have had success in preserving some of the very dense vegetation, the overall trend shows a significant loss of vegetated land in on the borders of and outside Sanjay Gandhi National Park. This shows that there is a very delicate balance between urban expansion and environmental conservation. Because even when we're talking about the legal protection of protected areas, we have consequences to that, like social consequences, because people are of marginalized communities are kind of losing access to the resources. The local communities which used to be living in the area before it was declared to be a protected area have also been displaced, and there is a lot of loss of livelihood. So we have to understand that while this legal protection ensures that the vegetation remains dense, we have to also understand the repercussions of this legal protection. And of course, like we have the fragmentation of habitats due to the urban expansion into the borders of Sanjay Gandhi National Park. And this not only isolates wildlife but also disrupts ecological processes. And while our main concern is often species endangerment or extinction because of the encroachment, the island system that we see in Sanjay Gandhi National Park, where it is surrounded by dense urban growth, this has led to significant human wildlife conflict, especially with species like leopards, where both parties are being harmed, where leopards encroach into forests, into villages nearby. And people are also encroaching in order to keep the leopards inside the territory of Sanjay Gandhi National Park. Of course, one of the significant legal safeguards, which is the Forest Conservation Act of 1980, has aimed to protect forest land from being converted. But this is not enough because we need effective conservation, which includes both governmental and local community stakeholders, which should engage in more sustainable forest management practices from the bottom up. Thank you.
Thank you, Aura. Next, we have Vandana. This is the last paper of our panel. The title of our paper is When Everyone is an Other, Rethinking Suburban Housing in Frontier Regions of Bengaluru. Okay, so the title is changed.
Yeah. Uh, yeah, so the title has changed. I'm calling the paper Spaces in Transition, Housing, Communities, and Singlehood in Bangalore's Frontier Regions. I think Latika gave us a good introduction to Bangalore and its urban landscape. In my presentation, I'm going to, speak about my research intent and how it changed throughout the course of this research. I use an ethnographic methodology to understand the lived experience of a single Muslim woman who lives in the frontier region of Bangalore called Sarjapura. And I'll give a little bit of a background to singlehood as a category with which I'd started the research. Singlehood has been studied as one of the structural inequalities and discriminatory practices that take place in access to urban housing and the rental market in general. A lot of research has focused on how single women especially find it difficult to access these spaces, and more than access, also difficult to retain the space once they've claimed the space. They're usually harassed by neighbors or constantly surveilled and have to adhere to a particular social script. Uh, and Along with singlehood, even religion and caste has been studied as social identities that have been, that influence one's access to housing. So initially, I went into the interview wanting to know how Saira, who's my interlocutor, her experience has been as a single Muslim woman. And she pushed me to actually not think about this category and think about the space that she was in. Because the space that she occupied was a frontier region. It was in the fringes of the city. And it offered newer realities and newer experiences that were different from the center. So instead of being constricted and immobilized, she was actually freer. And I'm using this term very carefully. So Lefebvre, in his theoretical framework of space, he collapses this kind of distinction between physical space and social space. And he says that both, in some sense, co-produce each other. And this is where I started thinking about what frontier spaces could mean, and how they define, how they create new subjects, and also often subvert dominant narratives and dominant structural inequalities. So this is what she says, everyone's an outsider, no one's really from here, which means that there's a little bit less formal systems of policing and surveillance. Let's look at what Sarjapura looks like. These maps are just for reference. So Sarjapura in the Google Maps, you can see, is at the edge. It's in the border of Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. And it's newly upcoming. You see built up area, urban built up area coming up later in 2016, 2017, and that's what the maps are showing. So it is a kind of newer society, which makes it frontier in some sense. And frontier societies have also had very contested kind of definitions. It comes from a very European settler colonial narrative where frontier spaces are defined as spaces without histories or spaces without people. But that isn't the case. And now newer literature that's focused in India talk about frontier societies as spaces of conflict, where you have new migrants coming in, usually upper middle class, coming in because IT hubs are there or there's more residential spaces over there. And they are often in conflict with local communities and agrarian spaces. So that's the focus, but there's no focus really on what is happening within these upper middle class housing societies. How are they coming about? How are social relations within the upper middle class society taking place? And that is kind of the focus of this research. So Saira talks about certain kinds of themes within Sarjapura. One of the themes is that everybody is an outsider. Everyone's coming from outside. It's a diverse, heterogeneous space, but heterogeneity doesn't really dictate a kind of equality in some sense. But what it does is, in this particular space, there's a lack of social or moral codes that are enforced because of not just the distance from the center, but also that RWAs as a system don't exist. What they have is a WhatsApp group. And so it's not really, even though you have the larger socio-political context existing, there's no enforcement of an urban self. She speaks about how the people in her society have tried to establish a structure. They've tried to make an RWA, but they've often failed because the space does not allow for it. Everyone who's occupying the space is either working somewhere or don't have the time to do it, and there's no vocabulary to tell us what is good behavior and bad behavior, unlike in the center of the city, where Brahminized colonies and gated communities exist. She also talks about her own, experience as a single Muslim woman, but also someone who engages in a very alternative lifestyle. But the space that she occupies, because everybody is, in a sense, another, and everybody is trying to make sense of a loose, shared sense of space, and trying to translate that into a community, that she gets to do whatever she wants to do, and her identity as a single Muslim woman doesn't come out as much. And there's this interesting thing that happens where there are all of these social events and cultural events within these spaces that happen, like Independence Day, Republic Day. And during the time I was interviewing her, the Ram Mandir inauguration happened, and she was talking about how she felt like people would come and question her, and they would ask her, "What was your opinion?" or whatever, and she expected to feel threatened. But that didn't happen. And she talked about how her neighbors are Bandra Christian and Bandra Brahmins, and they speak to each other a lot because they come from the same regional identity, but they hate each other because one's non-vegetarian, one's vegetarian. So there's a restricted, they share identities, but it's in a restricted sense, and this kind of distrust that they have with each other enables a harmony within the space. So distrust and a kind of not willingness to actually engage beyond necessary is what makes the space harmonious. And she said that, there's no need to preserve some character of a neighborhood because, no one's attempting to do that. Unlike the center of the city, like Jayanagar, where Narayana Murthy lives, where it has a pristine sense, of a neighborhood that is supposed to be a particular way. Um, But there are sort of limits to this understanding of a frontier, right? I don't want to push it also too further to say that moving to the frontier means getting freedom, because the distance of the frontier from the center doesn't mean that it's void of larger structural uh, inequalities and power structures. And so she speaks about these events, like I was saying, Republic Day, Independence Day, and the WhatsApp group would ask people to contribute. And the first people who would contribute from this apartment complex would be the three Muslim people, and they'd contribute the highest because they would want to get out of, any kind of assumption that they're not patriotic. So there's a performance of like a secularism, performance of secularism that allows them to get away with, being Muslim. Um, in that sense, their religious identity comes out, but maybe singlehood not as much in this space. And frontier spaces do create new urban subjects. They create new urban identities, new social relationships that are founded on these loose structures. But what they're also doing is what Lefebvre spoke about, is that they're representative spaces. They represent the larger socio-political context, and they're also being incorporated, within within the Bangalore Center, within this idea of monolith of the gated community. Um, so, in conclusion, the frontier region does enable certain social relations that subvert these dominant social structures. Saira's experience of feeling more freer, not really facing harassment from her landlord. All of these things are, take place in the frontier. But it is also, uh, you know, there's a sense of individualism that is promoted, either because neoliberalism and this sense of development that is happening in the frontier is promoting this kind of individualism and anonymity that people don't prefer to really engage with each other, or even have these Independence Day, Republic Days within societies, or even know who's your next door neighbor. They don't want to know anymore. So what does a community look like then in the frontier, and is it even right for us to use the word community, because a shared sense of space does not really translate to a community or an urban community? And I think that's where I was headed with this paper. And yeah, I'd like to think about that question with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Vandana. So uh, I think we don't have much time. We started late and we are supposed to conclude by now, 10:15 that is. But very quickly, if we have questions for our panelist, we could go around.
Am I audible? My question is for. It has the least amount of land allotted to it. And that increase, and like the way you think about conservation work, it's so much easier when it's restricted intensively to a small space, as opposed to doing larger sorts of taking up larger measures, which will have a more, sort of uniform effect or impact. It from a policy perspective also it's harder. So I was just thinking, I was just looking at that, and I was thinking that, I mean, this makes sense. It's a small piece of, I mean, small, relatively speaking, small piece of land, but it's also easier to work with, which is why it's probably, the exterior peripheries of this Sanjay Gandhi National Park are being depleted while the inside is constantly being intensified. Right?
Exactly. Even legally, when we're talking about a protected area, often what happens is all these projects that, like these um, urban development, infrastructure development projects that happen nearby, um, we see that a lot of times, like the borders are little bit like tweaked. Especially like the buffer zones. So initially it used to be like about 10 kilometers, and it has been like decreasing, increasing constantly, depending on who is exactly doing the project, and um, whether the person is actually in a place of power, and depending on the public, like public interest. The borders of Sanjay Gandhi National Park, which is the only national park in Mumbai, they are also being moved closer and closer down. And I mean, of course, that talks about what the priority is for the government. But also, we have like the core, which is just easier to stay dense. And I mean, that is because it's harder and harder to get to the center. So, yeah, exactly. You're right. And thank you for noticing that.
I have a couple of questions to a couple of different speakers. So, first one is to Latika. So, when you said moving of people to satellite towns, it normally obviously it increases the size of the city and therefore people move out. Won't this lead to your project being inevitably longer and continuously going on, and therefore making it harder and still being a project like the metro that takes unnecessarily longer than it should be taking?
So I did mention, I think that delays are a part and parcel of whatever development we are making, right? But one of the main differentiating points between a metro being developed in such an area and a suburban rail being developed was that we lack the technological capabilities to develop metro by ourselves. So at this point, we do have a good railway network. uh, I mean, we do have good capabilities to set up a railway network more than a metro. Also, because sanctioning is a big issue, we tend to get funded by maybe like get our technology from abroad and take inspiration from other countries. But it is true that this, I think, even in the case of Mumbai, you can see there is a new city coming up, which is Naina, somewhere around Navi Mumbai nearby. So the main issue is that you can see cities expanding to great lengths, and that is inevitable because obviously the population is growing massively, but it is a much faster project. So right now, how Bangalore is functioning is very, very inefficient for the long run. Say you can spend close to 3 hours, 4 hours just to cover a simple distance. Like maybe 30 kilometers is the distance from maybe North Bangalore to East Bangalore, is where the IT hub is. But people end up spending at least 4.5 hours, even though we have a good outer ring road built and a good connectivity system in terms of roads. But over time, no one tends to pay attention to what is to be improved in this infrastructure.
Okay, just one more question. And what would make people switch from whatever their current traditional mode of transport is, except for just the time? Because public transport is still there, it's still cheap. People still choose to go in their cars and drive there themselves, take their bikes, leading to the traffic, obviously. And I myself, I stay in North Bangalore. I used to stay in East Bangalore, actually, so I know the exact places you're talking about. And I would still prefer choosing certain modes of transport purely because of other reasons. So, what would act as a catalyst for people to then make this change anyway?
So, speaking from what my observation is in the past few, so people were used to drive to Bangalore, right, on a daily basis, commute to the IT area. But in the recent times, you can see that the metro has been developed, which goes to the IT area. So the problem there is overcrowding of the metro. During peak hours, you cannot even step into metros, and then the frequency is still not high enough. So to make at least those people who are left out to move to the suburban would be a good shift. Obviously, I'm not saying that it's easy for people to shift to public modes of transport because people are still they prefer their cars. But in Bangalore, in general, now people are getting tired of taking out their own cars if they have something like metro, because you know cut to cut you are not going to encounter any traffic, so it's not uncertain ETA.
Okay, thank you so much. My next question is to Vandana, if that's
Please wait, wait, because others, or could we come back to you later? We don't have much time. So, Tanishta, over to you.
Yeah, hi. I don't know whether I'm audible, but my voice is generally loud. So, it's more like a comment and not just a question, which is to I think most of the presenters, but I didn't I was not there. I came in a little late. So the other than the last presentation, I think my general comment, and I know that this is a great platform for some of you to be presenting your initial research. I think it's important to keep in mind that, I mean, the research needs to be kind of motivated by a critical question, and then the data part of it. For most of the presentations, what I felt is that there has been data that has been amassed, and then you're trying to fit into a question. So the research process has worked in an opposite way, right? I mean, at least what it seems, it's completely possible that the process was what is originally expected, but it seemed to me that the data is informing the research, not the research question informing the research, right? And that's also the reason why the claims that were being made seem to be rather tall, based on the limited findings that most of you had. So I think these are some of the things, like I think and I know that I mean, some of you added the caveat that this is like preliminary research, and hence there's you are going to be unraveling more interesting things, but it's not about unraveling interesting things, because it's not a it's not a mystery thriller. It's about research that needs to be rigorously grounded, right? And for which I think for most of the presentations that I was here, it felt to me that they fall into the trap of what we call environmental determinism, which essentially means that the environmental factors, right, or development factors are governing the research logic, right? So for example, someone talked about wastewater management, someone talked about the commute, and so on and so forth, and hence proposing an alternative way of doing that. And these are like great urban policies, right? But the problem with these policies, and which is why, like I guess urban studies in general in India and most in developing regions tend to be so chaotic, is that there's a singular focus on one dimension of the problem. So in most of the presentations, it seemed to me the problem is just the environment, but the environment is not just the physical infrastructure of it, right? But it's important to look at the caste composition, people's income composition, in addition to the physical aspects of that area. And I felt that that would make the research much more compelling, even when you're making those claims about policies, than just focusing on the environment or the and my last quick bit is for the last presentation. I think it's a very interesting research, and I like where you're heading to, but I feel like the story seems a little bit simplistic at this point, and I know that you're going to be of course complicating it, because I feel the Muslim identity is a hyphenated identity in urban India, in fact in India, so to speak. So I feel like looking at this particular narrative of this woman, right, who is a Muslim subject, in addition to the frontier, right, being this kind of a larger kind of a I would say macro context where they are embedded. I think that nexus between the individual and the larger context, needs to be I guess harnessed a little bit more critically, because you cannot just take this woman as an independent neoliberal subject, because I think her religious identity and her singlehood, those are intersecting forces, that kind of also co-produce her subjectivity. And I think that's important to keep that in mind. I'm sure you'll do that, but just kind of, yeah, that's all, Anup. Thank you so much.
So we have one last question now, and after that we need to finish. We are already exceeding our panel time by 11 minutes now.
Yeah. So my question is to Vandana. I just want you to reflect on a particular case from Hyderabad where I've stayed for 2 years. This particular neighborhood, around 3-4 square kilometers of neighborhood, this is completely a Muslim neighborhood. I stayed in a Muslim housing society, right? And still they had to represent in themselves in certain ways. So the locale was not able to protect them from falsely representing them in a certain way. Where, for example, they had to celebrate Republic Days for 3 days, where it doesn't happen in any kind of housing society. The Independence Day for 3 days, and it was a celebration like a mela or a fair. So, or to that scale, from a housing society of 300 or 200 houses. So, that idea that if you're at frontier, or if you are certain in a certain spatial arrangement, will be able to protect you in a certain way, or not force you in a certain way. I want you to reflect on it a little bit. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. But I think in the context of the frontier, they're trying to engage in a kind of secularism, right? Like to be, you have this idea of a secular Muslim, right? Who does not have markers of being Muslim. Like this woman does not have a marker of being Muslim. Like she's atheist and she does not practice religion that way. So it hides her identity in some way. But yeah, there is a sense of like you have to, if there is an event, if in the housing society, which is predominantly say middle to upper class, you have to engage with it more than say the Hindu subject would have to, because that's the way to protect yourself in some way, protect yourself from repercussions within, from with your neighbors, or just to hide your identity, hide your Muslim identity, because you're already living a kind of anomalous like life, right? Like where people can't really tell what's going on. Like this is a single woman, she's 40, and she's not at home at all, and she's Muslim, but doesn't really practice anything, so you can't tell what this figure is. So you want to protect that kind of anomaly, like the performance of an anomaly. So I think that's where it's a little bit different, because people don't enforce a kind of rule. I think in gated communities within the city there are more enforced rules, right, in terms of what you can eat. Also in gated communities inside the city, even getting access for her would be a much different story. Like she would probably not have gotten the space that she has right now.
Thank you. So with this, we come to an end of this panel presentation. I thank all the panelists, especially Shreya, for coming all the way from Kerala. She's not from Flame, but I really appreciate your participation in our conference. Also, our alumni, Latika and Raman, who are coming all the way from Bangalore and Mumbai, and also our current students, Vandana and Aura. Thank you so much. And I also thank all the audience who are present here for encouraging our students. Thank you.